For the police, the tragedy involving his daughter became just another dusty file in the archives. For the rich kids who did it, it was just a joke. But for Arthur Vance, it was the most important thing in his life. This is the story of a man who lost his daughter. And the revenge of the enraged father was so cruel that even investigators with 20 years of experience couldn't bear to look at what he left behind. Emily Vance was 20 years old. She worked as a florist assistant in a small flower shop on Main Street in Bridgeport, the very same Bridgeport where factories were closing. Neighborhoods were becoming deserted and every other shop on the high street had its windows boarded up. But the flower shop was holding on, and Emily held on with it. She woke up at 5:30, made coffee for her father, left a cup on the table by the door. He left for the factory even earlier and rode to work on an old bicycle that creaked at every turn. Her neighbors knew her by that sound. Every morning, without exception. The squeak of the wheels, the clatter of the pedals, a quiet good morning, and then on down North Avenue, past the closed laundromat, past the bus stop, past the car park at Bridgeport Meats, where her father worked. She was neither ambitious nor naive. She simply lived as everyone else in their neighborhood did, quietly, modestly, without excessive expectations. She had few friends. She didn't go to parties and didn't try to get into circles that were beyond her means. But in the early autumn of 1991, something changed. Through the flower shop, she met a girl from Darien who ordered bouquets for events held by a student club at one of the private colleges in Fairfield County. The club was called Apollo. Emily didn't know its name or what it stood for. To her, she was just a customer who left generous tips and once said, "You're sweet. You need to get out of this neighborhood. Come over on Saturday. Yes, we're having a party at the country house. You'll relax." Emily didn't want to go. She had been hesitating all week, but on Friday evening, she got another call, telling her they would pick her up. She agreed. It seemed like a chance to see something different. Not boarded-up shop windows, not the smell of bleach from the laundry, not the squeaking of bicycle pedals at 5:45 in the morning. On Saturday, October 12th, a white SUV came to pick her up. Emily sat in the back seat. Music was playing in the car. It smelled of expensive perfume, and someone handed her a glass of champagne. She didn't know anyone there, but she smiled. For the first time in a long time. The party was held in a country mansion in Weston, a quiet town with a population of just over 10,000, where the average family income is over $300,000 a year. The house belonged to the family of one of the members of the Apollo Club. It was a 3-story building with a swimming pool, utility rooms, and an industrial cold storage room in the basement. The former owner was in the restaurant business. Emily spent her first 3 hours in this house as a guest. Then, she spent almost a day as a prisoner. What happened next has been reconstructed based on testimony that was never accepted by the court. Around midnight, a group of 5 young men, all members of Apollo, all children of high-ranking officials and businessmen in the district, took Emily to the basement. They told her that it was part of the program, that everyone goes through it, that it was a performance. They took her into an industrial refrigerator. Among the carcasses of animals hanging on hooks, they stripped her and forced her to pose, to imitate merchandise on display. They filmed it on video, commenting aloud. Proletarian variety. Second class. Not even good enough for minced meat. They laughed. She cried. Then she stopped. Emily spent almost 22 hours in the refrigerator. When she was found, she was alive, but her body was shaking so badly that 2 paramedics couldn't hold her. Her body temperature had dropped below 34 degrees. She had frostbite on her fingers and toes. But that wasn't the worst of it. Emily stopped talking. She stopped responding to voices, to touch, to her name. She would cower in a corner at the sight of any shiny metal, a spoon, a door handle, a bag clasp. Psychiatrists would later call this living doll syndrome. a deep dissociative reaction to trauma in which the mind shuts down to protect itself from what the body has experienced. Her father, Arthur Vance, picked up the statement from the flower shop, took his daughter home, and did not leave the flat for 3 days. On the 4th day, he went to the police. And this is where the part of the story begins that turned an ordinary butcher from Bridgeport into a man who would become the talk of Fairfield County. Arthur Vance was born in 1946 in Bridgeport, into a family where men worked with their hands, not their words. His father, Raymond Vance, was a butcher at Bridgeport Meats, one of the last large businesses still operating in the city before deindustrialization caught up with them. His mother left when Arthur was 7. He never spoke about her, either then or later. Her name appears once in the case file, in the mother field on his birth certificate. Raymond raised his son the best he could, through work. At 12, Arthur entered the factory floor for the first time. At 14, he was already helping his father on the cutting line. At 16, he received his first professional knife. It was a German Friedrich Dick brand boning knife, the very brand that would later play a key role in his exposure. Arthur kept that knife his entire life. For him, it was not a tool. It was a legacy. He did not seek contact with others. On the contrary, he avoided people, keeping his inner world closed. Among his colleagues at the factory, he was considered quiet, not rude, not strange, just quiet. He arrived before everyone else, left last, and almost never participated in conversations in the smoking room. He rarely spoke about himself and always chose to be an observer. His bosses appreciated him. Arthur worked accurately, quickly, and didn't ask questions. By the age of 30, he had become a master butcher, the highest qualification at the factory. His character was shaped by constant isolation. He had no friends outside of work. He didn't drink, go to bars, or watch sports on television. The only person he was attached to was his daughter Emily, who was born in 1971. Emily's mother, Jean, left 2 years after giving birth, and Arthur raised his daughter alone. Without help, without complaints, without explanations. Neighbors remembered him as a man who never raised his voice. He repaired the fence, mowed the lawn, and left the rubbish bags neatly by the curb in the mornings, always at the same time. From an early age, Emily showed signs of her father's obsessive control. Not aggressive, but protective. He walked her to school every day until she was 13. He didn't allow her to sleep over at her friends' houses. He knew her schedule by heart, every hour, every route, every turn. For Arthur, Emily was the only proof that his life had meaning. Everything else, work, the factory, routine, was just background. Emily was the center. And that is precisely why what happened in October 1991 did not simply hurt him. It switched something inside him that could never be turned back. In his early years, no one noticed anything alarming about Arthur. But if you look at his profile through the eyes of a criminal psychologist, the picture becomes clearer. Closed off. Hyper-control. Attachment to a single object. Absolute self-sufficiency. Lack of external support. And a profession that for 30 years taught him one thing: how to cut up a body with surgical precision. No one took the early incidents seriously, but they were the first building blocks of his future behavior. Colleagues recalled that once, when a new employee at the factory made fun of Arthur in front of everyone, he did not respond. He just looked at him silently. A week later, that employee found his locker in the changing room broken into, with neatly stacked pieces of raw meat inside. No one could prove that Arthur had done it, but no one tried to joke with him again. Among his acquaintances, he seemed inconspicuous, but inside, his own logic of the world was already maturing, a logic in which justice was measured not by law, but by precision. On the 4th day after Arthur picked up his daughter from the hospital, he put on a clean shirt, buttoned it all the way up, and drove to the Bridgeport police station. He took with him the medical report, the discharge summary from the emergency room, and a piece of paper on which he had handwritten the names of 5 people, those whom Emily had named before she fell silent forever. The duty officer took the statement. It was registered under a standard number, as a domestic incident involving elements of abuse. Arthur was told to wait. He waited. 2 weeks later, he received a phone call asking him to come in. Not to be informed about the progress of the investigation, but to be told why there would be no investigation. The detective, whose name was never identified in the case file, told Arthur that his daughter's testimony could not be used as grounds for opening a case. Emily was in a state that rendered her incapable of legal action. The video recording Emily had mentioned before she stopped talking was never found. The owner of the mansion, the father of one of the members of the Apollo Club, a major developer from Weston, hired lawyers who filed 3 counterclaims within 10 days for defamation, trespassing, and attempted extortion. Arthur didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't cry. He listened to everything, stood up, took a copy of his statement, and left. According to the surveillance camera footage in the corridor of the police station, he paused at the exit for 4 seconds. He just stood there. Then he went out into the street. The investigation into Emily's case was effectively closed before it even began. None of the 5 individuals she named were called in for questioning. None of the witnesses at the party were interviewed. The developer's family's lawyers sent a letter to the district prosecutor's office, recommending that the situation not be escalated, given the mental state of the complainant and the lack of objective evidence. In Fairfield County in the early 1990s, this worked flawlessly. Bridgeport, a city that declared bankruptcy in 1991, had neither the resources nor the political will to stand up to the families of Weston, Darien, and Greenwich. The Bridgeport Police Department was chronically understaffed at the time, with fewer than 400 active officers for 160,000 residents. The priority was street crime, drugs, and gangs, not a butcher's claim that his daughter had been bullied at a party for rich kids. The case was shelved. Emily remained in her room, motionless, silent, her eyes fixed on a single point. Arthur fed her with a spoon, changed her clothes, and sat down next to her bed every evening. He waited for her to speak. She did not speak. During this period, from late October to December 1991, neighbors noticed that Arthur had stopped leaving his house in the evenings. The lights in his windows burned late into the night. He stopped saying hello. He stopped taking out the rubbish on schedule. He stopped leaving a cup of coffee at the door, because there was no one left to pick it up. And then, in January 1992, the Bridgeport Meats cold storage plant closed down. It was the last business in the area. Arthur lost his job. But he didn't go to the job center. He didn't look for a new job. He took the only thing from his desk, a leather case with knives, the very same set that contained the Friedrich Dick knife his father had given him. The system had failed. And he saw this not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Without a job, without obligations, without a daughter who could stop him, Arthur Vance was left alone with 5 names on a piece of paper and 30 years of experience with a blade. What happened next was not an impulse. It was not a breakdown. It was a decision, cold, calculated, and final. It was then that he stopped looking for ways out. He began to create them himself, at the expense of others. After that event, his decisions became direct, cold, and devoid of doubt. Arthur Vance no longer waited for justice. He became it. The first murder took place in March 1994, more than 2 years after his daughter's case was closed. This time, gap is important. Arthur did not act in the heat of the moment. He had been preparing. According to the reconstruction of the investigation between 1992 and 1994, Arthur Vance carried out detailed work to gather information about each of the 5 members of the Apollo Club named by Emily. He studied their routines, routes, habits, and weaknesses. He knew where they studied, where they lived, when they returned home, and which roads they used. He acted like a man who had spent his entire life observing and had found a use for this skill for the first time. The victims were all similar. Young men aged between 22 and 26, from wealthy families, living in the suburbs of Fairfield County. All 5 were connected to the Apollo Club, but by the time the crimes began, they had already moved to different cities and pursued different career paths. One worked for his father's development company. Another was studying at law school. The third lived off his family trust fund and was not employed anywhere. The fourth had moved to Stamford. The fifth remained in Weston. Arthur found each one of them, slowly, without rushing, without making mistakes. The pattern was the same in all 5 cases. The abductions took place in the evening, in areas with minimal CCTV coverage. Arthur chose stretches of road between residential areas and commercial zones where lighting was poor and traffic was low. He used an unmarked van, which was never found. None of the victims were abducted from their homes, workplaces, or public places. All 5 were intercepted en route, on the very stretches of road that Arthur had studied for months. After being abducted, the victims were taken to the basement of Arthur's house, a 2-story building in a working-class neighborhood on the eastern outskirts of Bridgeport. The basement had a cold storage room that Arthur built himself using industrial equipment discarded when Bridgeport Meats closed down. Investigators would later refer to this room as the maturing chamber, a term that Arthur himself apparently used. Each victim went through 3 stages. Arthur named them after the stages of meat processing at a factory. The first stage was devaluation. The victims were stripped naked, placed in a cold room among hanging pieces of meat, and left in the cold for several hours. The temperature in the chamber was maintained at -2 to -4 degrees. Arthur recreated the conditions in which his daughter had been kept, but with one difference. He did not laugh. He did not film it. He just waited. The second stage was the technological map. Shallow but precise incisions were found on the victims' bodies, corresponding to standard patterns used in the butchering of prime beef. Forensic experts noted that each incision was not random. It had anatomical logic. The incisions on the tongue were made by the person who verbally abused Emily. The incisions on the arms were made by the person who used physical force. The incisions on the eyelids were made by the person who filmed the video. Arthur wasn't just inflicting pain. He was marking them. He was mapping onto their bodies what each of them had done to his daughter. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a system. The third stage was the quality mark. Arthur branded the letters defective on each victim's chest with an old industrial meat branding iron. He had taken the iron from the factory on his last day of work. For him, it meant one thing. These people were defective. Not goods, not people. Defects that needed to be disposed of. 3 years passed between the first and 5th murders. Arthur acted at intervals of 4 to 9 months. He never repeated the same abduction pattern twice. He changed the time of day, the point of interception, and the method of approach. He left no signs of a struggle at the scene of the abduction, indicating that the victims either did not expect the attack or were immobilized instantly. For 3 years, Fairfield County Police did not link the 5 disappearances to a single series. The first 2 cases were classified as missing persons. The third was classified as a possible murder, but without a body. The body of the first victim was found only 11 months later, in an abandoned industrial building on the outskirts of Bridgeport. By that time, Arthur was already working on his 4th target. The investigation was riddled with errors. The police searched for connections between the victims in criminal databases, but all 5 had clean records. Profilers assumed that the killer was a psychopath with sexual motives because the victims were naked. No one considered the possibility of revenge. No one looked for a connection between the victims and a specific event that had taken place 3 years earlier. No one remembered the statement made by the butcher from Bridgeport that his daughter had been hurt at a party. Arthur did not become bolder. He became more precise. With each new episode, he adjusted the details, reducing the holding time, changing the method of transport, cleaning the van more thoroughly. He learned from each job, just as he learned from each new order at the factory, through repetition, through control, through improvement. But in the 5th episode, something happened that Arthur hadn't planned for. He made a tiny mistake, so small that he probably didn't even notice it himself. And it was this mistake that marked the beginning of the end for him. The 5th victim was discovered in February 1997 in an abandoned warehouse in the industrial area of Bridgeport, 3 miles from Arthur Vance's home. The body was lying on a metal table, naked, with characteristic cuts and the words "U.S. rejected" branded on the chest. Everything matched the previous 4 incidents. But in this last case, the county medical examiner noticed a detail that no one had noticed before. Microscopic nicks were found on the edges of the cuts, traces barely visible to the naked eye, which indicated not just a sharp knife, but a specific type of blade with a characteristic sharpening profile. The expert requested a ballistic examination of the cold weapon, a procedure that was extremely rare in the mid-1990s and was only used in exceptional cases. The results came back 6 weeks later. The nicks matched those of a professional Friedrich Dick brand boning knife, a German tool used in meat processing plants. But not just any model. The examination established that the marks were left by a blade from a series that was discontinued in the late 1970s. This meant that the knife was old, not recently purchased but stored for decades. It was a professional's working tool, not a purchase from a shop. This detail proved to be pivotal. Until that moment, investigators had been working with the profile of a serial killer, presumably a man aged between 35 and 45 with a psychosexual motive, operating in Fairfield County. The revenge theory had not been considered, but the knife changed the direction of the investigation. Detective Michael Corrigan of the Bridgeport Police Department, the only one whose name appears in the public case files, received the results of the examination and began to construct a new chain of events. He requested a list of all meat processing plants in the county that had closed in the last 10 years. Bridgeport Meats was at the top of the list. Corrigan then requested lists of former employees of the plant and received 312 names. But he didn't check all 312. He did what no investigator had done in 3 years. He dug up the archived statements related to the victims. Not the victims' criminal records, but complaints filed against them. And in a dusty folder at the Bridgeport Police Station, he found a statement from October 1991. The complainant was Arthur Vance, a butcher at the Bridgeport Meats cold storage plant. The complaint concerned the brutal treatment of his daughter by 5 members of the Apollo Student Club. The case was closed without prosecution. All 5 names in the complaint matched the 5 victims. Corrigan would later say in an interview with a local newspaper that the moment he placed the 2 lists, side by side, the list of victims and the list of names from Vance's statement, he had no doubt. 5 out of 5. 100% match, not a coincidence. Not a fluke. A system. A search warrant for Arthur Vance's home was issued 48 hours later. When the police entered the basement, they discovered a maturing chamber, a fully functional industrial-grade cold storage unit. Inside were metal hooks, a stainless steel table, a drainage system in the floor, and a set of professional knives in a leather case. Among them was a Friedrich Dick boning knife with a blade matching the results of the examination. On the wall of the chamber hung a standard technological chart for cutting up beef carcasses, the same kind used in factories across the country. But on this chart, certain cutting areas were circled in red marker and labeled by hand. The labels corresponded to the names of the victims. Arthur Vance was arrested on the 23rd of March, 1997, at his home. He did not resist arrest. He was sitting in an armchair next to his daughter's room when there was a knock at the door. He opened it himself. He was wearing a clean shirt, buttoned up to the top. The same habit he had on the day he came to the police station to file a report 6 years ago. During questioning, Arthur Vance did not utter a word. He remained silent for 14 hours straight. He did not request a solicitor. He didn't ask for water. He didn't ask for a break. He just sat there and stared at the wall. And only once, at the end of the interrogation, did he look at Detective Corrigan and utter a single sentence. "Have you ever seen a broken doll cry? I just returned them to their true state. A piece of meat." Those were the last words Arthur Vance uttered in the presence of law enforcement officials. The trial of Arthur Vance began in September 1997 and lasted 11 weeks. The prosecution presented 5 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. The defense attempted to build a case of insanity, citing trauma caused by his daughter's condition and prolonged social isolation. The forensic psychiatric examination rejected this argument. The experts unanimously found Vance to be sane and capable of understanding the nature of his actions. Moreover, the level of planning demonstrated in each episode ruled out the possibility of acting in the heat of passion. Arthur did not admit guilt. He did not deny what he had done. He simply refused to speak. Throughout the entire trial, he did not utter a single word, neither in his own defense, nor in response to the charges, nor to the victims' families. He sat in the courtroom in the same position he had sat in during the interrogation, motionless with his back straight, staring at a single point. The jury reached a verdict after 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all 5 counts. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The public reaction was unexpectedly mixed. The victims' families demanded the death penalty and filed civil suits against Vance. But in Bridgeport and in working-class neighborhoods throughout the county, the attitude was different. Several local newspapers published articles about how Arthur's statement had been ignored by the police. Journalists raised the question: if Emily Vance's case had been investigated in 1991, would those 5 people still be alive? There was no answer, but the question remained. Handling reports of violent crimes were implemented in Fairfield County. In particular, mandatory cross-checking of pending reports when serial incidents occurred. Detective Corrigan was promoted and transferred to the Connecticut State Serial Crimes Unit. Emily Vance remained in the same house. Arthur's cousin from Stratford was appointed her guardian. According to social services, Emily's condition had not changed. She still did not speak. She still did not respond to her name. She still cowered in the corner at the sight of shiny metal. Arthur wrote her letters from prison, every week, without fail. She never opened them. Arthur Vance died in a maximum security prison in 2014. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. He was 68 years old. He never spoke again, not to lawyers, psychologists, or journalists who requested interviews dozens of times. The only things found in his cell after his death were a photograph of Emily at the age of 5 and a leather knife case. Empty. The case is closed. But the shadow it left behind proved longer than the sentence, because justice is not always the law. Sometimes it is simply a question that no one wanted to answer in time.